We're going through the prophecies of Enoch from the book of Enoch, and we're just about ready to finish tonight the fallen angel history, which is chapters 6 through 16. We got up to the first half of chapter 14 last week, and that was up to the judgment of the fallen angels, the judgment of the Nephilim and the Watchers, those things, the civil war that occurred, how they destroyed each other. Not a whole lot of detail, but enough to see what was going on. And then they were to be imprisoned. And there were 3 prophecies connected with that. So if you want to go back and look at that, you can. So today we'll finish this up. We'll finish chapter 14 and do 15 and 16. And there'll be some really interesting things to it. So let's go ahead and get started. And we go to the book of Enoch. Now, this is chapter 14. So the final judgment, that prophecy was given. And we got up to verse 7. And so that was the end of that. So now he has another vision. And if you remember, and we'll see this a little bit, but there is a prophecy of a destruction of the world with a fire or a flood, both. Actually, before we start on that, let me go ahead and show you something. And I'm hopping over to our Ancient Prophecies Revealed. This is a lot smaller, but it's a bigger book, and I need to reformat it to get in here. But Adam's prediction. So this is one thing that we know the scrolls teach, that there are testaments that supposedly are written by everybody from Adam all the way down to Levi, or actually Aaron. And then we begin the time of Moses and Aaron, which starts with Genesis and goes forward. But those ancient testaments are pretty interesting to tell us the rest of the story. We don't have the testament of Adam, but notice what Josephus says about it. Josephus stated in Antiquities of the Jews 1, 2, 3 that Adam prophesied to his children the world would be destroyed twice, once by fire and once by a flood of water. But he was unsure which one came first. This is the way prophecy always is. You see a prophecy, and the main point is this. And then you start developing, well, how does that work? How does that work exactly? And then later on, someone gets another prophecy and you get more details. We see that all the way through the Old Testament. So this tells us, number one, that Adam did write a testament, and it contained a prophecy of the destruction of the world by water and one by fire. Now, Adam had Seth, and in another place, we're not going to look at it, but in another place, he talks about the writings of Seth. So there were writings of Seth. And then there was Cainan, and then Enos. We actually do have a piece of the testament of Enos in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this tells us, the book of Jasher actually tells us that Cainan wrote down things. So that's interesting. So we have corroboration that Adam, Seth, Cainan, and Enos all wrote things. So the first 4 patriarchs wrote things. If they did, the others did too. So pretty interesting. But here is what Jasher chapter 2, verses 11 and 13 say about Cainan. And so we just learned that Adam had a testament, and in there, among other things, he mentioned the world would be destroyed once by fire, once by water. And it says, Cainan grew and was 40 years old, and he became wise and had knowledge and skill and all wisdom, and reigned over the sons of men, and led the sons of men into wisdom and knowledge, among other things. It says, and Cainan knew by his wisdom that God would destroy the sons of men for having sinned upon the earth, and that the Lord would in the latter days bring upon them a flood of waters. And in those days Cainan wrote upon the tablets of stone, what would take place in the time to come, and put them in his treasures. Now, again, I want to pull your attention to in the latter days. So anytime you say the latter days or the end of time or end of days, we're talking about the end of an age. We do the same thing. We say, well, at the end of the world, or the latter times, the end of time, the end of days, when the Antichrist is here. And we all know that according to prophecy, the Antichrist is here for a 7-year period. Then there's a second coming. And then there's a 1,000-year millennial reign before eternity starts. So the latter days are not the end of this planet. So we've already had two sets of latter days or end of ages, and age is 2,000 years. So this tells us, number one, that he understood in the latter part of his days, a flood of water would come. So he understood that water was first. So with that in mind, I want to also take you to 2 Peter, kind of pull all these together. So this is interesting to see this. So 2 Peter chapter 3, we're just going to read the first few verses, or the first, I think 13 verses or so. Yeah. It says, "In this second epistle, beloved, I now write to you, in both which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance." So he's going to remind you of things. "That you be mindful of the words that were spoken before by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us, the apostles of our Lord and Savior. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts." Now, back in his time, that was the Sadducees. They didn't believe in anything supernatural, life after death, no Holy Spirit, no angels, nothing. And they wouldn't believe anything that happened. So they were the scoffers of that day. Today, we have the same thing, people that know about Christianity but don't believe any of it. So he says, knowing this first, there will become in the last days scoffers, walking after their own desires. He says, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since our fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Now, this is interesting in a couple of points, because number one, from the beginning of creation, everybody now believes in evolution, not creation. So when you see this, this is talking about not a secular world, but inside the church, there's going to be an apostasy. And a lot of people that go to church are going to believe in evolution rather than creation. But it's still creation in this sense. So the point is that they're making is, where's the promise of his coming? So in other words, I've heard you guys talk about the second coming and the Antichrist and the rapture, and you've talked about it year after year after year, and nothing ever changes. So, it's all a bunch of bull, is basically what they're going to be saying. So Peter has this response to that kind of an argument. He says, for this, they are willingly ignorant that the word of God, by the word of God, the heavens were of old, there was a creation, not an evolution, and that the earth standing out of the water and in the water, and thereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So they're willingly ignorant of a worldwide flood. The fact that there are bones of whales up in the tip top of mountains, should tell you something. And he's saying they're willingly ignorant of this. So in other words, his point is, if the first prophecies came to pass, so will the second ones. If none of it's ever come to pass, probably none of it will. That's just logic. And so he's saying that, where is the promise of his coming? It's never happened yet. Well, if it hasn't happened yet, it's closer now than it was before. And it's going to happen because the same book that prophesied that prophesied a lot of other things that did come to pass. He goes on and says, but the heavens and the earth, which are now by that same word, or that same set of prophecies, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. So, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day. So a lot of people will read this and say, the Lord, when he gets around to it, a day to him is like 1,000 years. So maybe it's tomorrow, maybe it's 100 years, maybe 300 years, whenever he gets around to it. That's how they kind of interpret this verse. And as we're seeing from Enoch, number one, he's saying that they're making the same mistake here. They're saying that there's not going to be any fire judgment or anything like that. Well, wait a minute. You're willingly ignorant of the fact that there was a water judgment. If there was a water judgment, there's going to be a fire judgment. And they basically don't believe in that either. How many people now say, oh, there never was a worldwide flood either? It was just a legend based off of a localized flood, that kind of thing. So, and he goes on and says, don't be ignorant of this one thing. Remember this one thing. A day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. That's a calendar term. And we'll study the calendar in a little bit later, probably coming up in the next section. But the idea of 7,000 years, 6,000 years of human history, and a millennial reign with Christ ruling is a basic teaching of church fathers, rabbis, Dead Sea Scrolls consistently. Now, again, our calendar may be off, so we can't really set a date on it for sure, but the concept is there, and we're closer now than we were yesterday. And that's a point that Peter is bringing out. There really was a worldwide flood, and if you look for evidence, you will find it. And if that happened, so will this. It's the same kind of argument that Paul uses in the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is written to the Jewish priests in the temple. And he's basically, giving a summary of the entire book of Hebrews. He's basically saying, look, the Pharisees taught this, the Sadducees taught this, the Essenes taught that. They're different. Pick whichever one you think is logical and follow it. And that's what you did. But then the Messiah came. He did certain things. You were there. You witnessed it. He resurrected the dead, healed the blind. Some of those people were your family members. You were there. You saw it. You tasted of the heavenly gifts, and you were a partaker of the age to come by seeing these things. Some of you even actually were healed by him too. So if you know this, now that you've seen it with your own eyes, you know the Pharisee and Sadducee ideas are wrong. So why stay in a denomination that's wrong? Get out of it. And then he begins to say, the old prophecies are true. If all of this is true, he came, died, resurrected. The prophecies out of Micah 5 and Enoch and the other places tell us that before the end of the age, the temple will be completely destroyed. So if you remain in the temple doing what you're doing, within the next 15 years, you're dead. Do you understand this? This is the prophecies here. I'm setting dates is basically what Paul would be saying. You know this. So think about it. You've seen the first ones come to pass. You know the second one is there's a date associated with it. You better move, and you better move quickly. And so basically that's the book of Hebrews. Peter's saying the same thing here, but this concept of 1,000 years to a day. He goes on and says, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, like whenever he gets around to it type deal. But he's long suffering toward us and not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But he really does want that. But there is a time limit on this. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. The earth and all the works therein will be burned up. That's the fire judgment that we learned from Enoch, from Adam, from many other Old Testament prophets. Seeing this then, that all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hastening to the coming of the day of the God, when the heavens being on fire will be dissolved and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for a new heavens and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. And this is what the prophets of old, all of them, inside and outside the Bible, have talked about. So what's interesting about this, and again, he's saying, if you've seen and you know there was a flood judgment, then you know there's going to be a fire judgment. And so very, very important. And he's connecting it with the calendar. So with this in mind, let's go back. We've seen this. Adam predicted a flood and a fire, didn't know which one's first. Cainan was able to ascertain the fact that the flood was going to happen first. Now where we're at, historically, we know the flood occurred. The fire judgment has not. So going back to Enoch, and this is the other part of chapter 14, starting in verse 8. This is the dream of the two houses. So he has already been basically talked about a flood, a destruction. We've seen a couple of prophecies back in there from both humans and Nephilim and other things. different dreams and visions. But this one, he says he sees a vision. Okay, so this was the vision that was shown to me. A mist enveloped me, again, water, a mist enveloped me, and a wind lifted me up to the clouds of heaven. And I saw stars and lightnings. So he's going up to heaven to see this vision. He's going to turn around and look back on the earth and see what's happening. So he sees this. He says, I was lifted up to heaven where I saw a wall made of crystals surrounded by tongues of fire, and that frightened me. So when you first look at this, you'll probably think of Acts chapter 2, the tongues of fire and the gift of languages, and that's not what we're talking about here. This is a dream, and it's going to mean something. And in the dream, he's lifted up from earth, he goes to heaven, and he first sees this wall, and the wall is crystal. It's like solid crystalline something, whatever that is. Not ice, there's a different word for ice, but just crystal. And it looks like fire, and there's tongues of fire in it. Now, at this point, you might say, well, if it's precious stones, when they glisten in the light, they make different colors. So maybe that's what he's saying. But it goes on and says the walls, it ends up being a house, not just a wall, when he gets closer to it. The walls and the floor were made of interlaid crystals. And so that's something to think about and study. I'm not sure what that means, but basically interwoven type crystals. It's all come together solid. The ceiling was clear like water, but made up of swirling stars, lightnings, with fiery cherubim in the midst of it. So again, almost like it doesn't have a roof, but you can see something, but through it you can see angels, stars, things like that. And look at this, though. It says, verse 12, a flaming fire surrounded the walls, and the door blazed with fire. So again, this represents kind of fire judgment. When I entered into that house, it was as hot as fire and as cold as ice. So that is pretty interesting. So in the dream, this doesn't have to be reality, but in the dream, it's as cold as ice and it's hot like fire. Again, water judgment, fire judgment. It was empty and there was nothing delightful in it. It's because this represents judgment. Not even a trace of life. That makes sense. Destruction of all life. I was so afraid, I fell on my face and then saw another vision. There appeared a second house. So first one, fire, ice, judgment, destruction, nothing good there. Greater than the first house. So much greater than earth and the people on it. All of its doors stood open before me. This almost looks like or sounds like a temple. You know, going into the temple, there's the different gates, different doors, kind of like that, something like that. It was built out of flames of fire. Now, when you see God, a lot of times there's flames of fire and different lights and thunders and lightnings and stuff coming off the throne. So that's kind of a common vision. And in every respect, it so excelled in splendor and magnificence to the extent that I cannot describe it to you. It was just so awesome that you can't even put it in words, he says. Its floor was of fire, and above it were lightnings and the path of the stars. Its ceiling also was a flaming fire. Inside was a lofty throne made of hoarfrost, with wheels shining as bright as the sun, and I heard the voices of the cherubim. Streams of flaming fire flowed from underneath the throne so brightly I could not look directly at them. The great Lord, so that would be God, the great Lord sat upon his throne, this throne, and his raiment was brighter than the sun and was whiter than any snow. It kind of reminds you of Daniel. the Ancient of Days took his seat, and his hair was as white as snow, eyes like flames of fire. None of the angels could enter or behold his face by reason of the magnificence and the glory, and no flesh could behold him. We're told the same thing, that flesh cannot see God and live. Remember, God said that to to Moses. The flaming fire was all around him, and a great fire stood before him, and none could come close to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, yet he needed no counselor. Now, if you're a judge on a throne and someone's standing before you, waiting, that means he's waiting on you to make a judgment. There's some sort of a judgment going on. He doesn't need any counselor or anything, even though there's a lot of judgments to be made. And there's 10,000 times 10,000. Now, in the olden days, there's a word for ones and tens and hundreds and thousands. 10,000 was the largest number that had a single word. At least that's what I was taught in seminary. So when you say 10,000 times 10,000 with thousands of thousands, that's about the biggest you can actually put into words. So it means a large number of people. So this is Judgment Day, in other words. So there's a time for judgment. There's going to be a ice, water, and fire judgment. And then there's going to be a day of judgment. And this is what we saw back earlier in the book of Enoch, when it talked about there was 70 generations to one event. It's the first coming. And then there was a second coming. And then there was a great judgment. So we're kind of seeing the same thing. He goes on and says, and the most holy ones who were around him never departed from him day or night. So this is very similar to Isaiah, when Isaiah said that he saw a vision of God, and then the seraphim, the fiery serpent creatures with the 6 wings, were flying around the throne, and they never departed. They always cried, holy, holy, holy is the Lord, and other visions like that. So this is very similar. Okay, and he said, until then, I had a veil on my face, trembling, and the Lord called to me with his own voice. And he said to me, come here, Enoch, and hear my word. And one of the holy ones came and lifted me up to the door, and I bowed my face downwards. So this is a really interesting passage here. And again, I think you're seeing the same thing over and over again. There's going to be these 2 judgments, okay? And fire and ice and water, that's for everybody. But now he's going to mention something that is specific to the judgment of the Nephilim. The title of this study is The Origin of Demons. We're going to find out about that. So here's the judgment of the Ancient of Days gives. So he says, fear not, Enoch, righteous man and scribe of righteousness. Again, he's a sinner just like you and me. So that's not the point. The point is that he loves the Lord, is waiting on Messiah, trusting Messiah, and that's how we get salvation. So he says, go say to the watchers of heaven who have sent you to intercede for them, you should intercede for men and not men for you. This is really interesting. Number one, we shouldn't be praying for angels or praying to angels or anything along those lines. Angels, if anything, should be praying for us. And he says this is his judgment to them. Why have you left the eternal heaven and lain with women, defiled yourselves with the daughters of men by taking them as wives, like the children of earth do, and begotten giants as your sons? Although you were holy, spiritual, living an eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh. and have lusted after the flesh and the blood, as the children of men do, who die and perish. Now, this word for lusted is, we usually think of it as sexual lust, but it means strong desire. So that's probably in here too. But again, it could also be the fact that they wanted to recreate something, or create, the desire for a family or an empire, or, create little weird creatures or whatever they're trying to create. That was their strong desire. And actual sexual lust might be in there too, but just strong desire like everyone else does. When you meet someone today, they're either obsessed, if you want to call it that way, they have strong desire, they think about all the time, either the things of God or their work or their wives, kids, family, sex, but it's always either sex, money, food, power, something like that. There's something that drives them, and it's usually connected with one of a handful of things. And so they're in the same boat. It says, this is why, talking about human beings, this is why I gave them wives, that they may beget children by them, and so nothing might be wanting to them in the earth. So in other words, each generation dies. If no one had any kids, there would be no one left. If these guys never had any kids, it would be fine because they're eternal, right? So that's the point. These guys don't need it. We're not designed for it. The other people need it, and we're designed for it, for whatever it is that they're doing. But you were formerly spiritual, immortal, for all the generations of the world. They would see the very first generation or jubilee, and they would live to see all of it, all the 7,000 years, not be aged or anything. That's why I did not appoint wives for you, for spiritual beings have heaven as their dwelling. And this reminds us of Jesus when he talked about when the Sadducee came. And he said, the Sadducee came to Jesus and said, there was a guy who married a girl and he died childless. So according to the Levite marriage law, she goes to the brother to raise up seed. Yeah, but he dies. And there were 7 brothers, and each one married her to fulfill the law, but they all died before there was any children. And then last of all, the woman died also. Kind of a twist on the story of Tobit, that whole concept. And so the question is, this is what's happened in this situation. So when they get to heaven, whose wife will she be? Because she had multiple marriages. So how does that work? And Jesus said, you err, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. In the resurrection, first off, they didn't believe in, a resurrection when we all die and go to heaven. Forget about the heaven part. In the resurrection, when we're back in flesh or in some sort of corporeal thing, in the resurrection, we will neither marry nor will be given in marriage, but we will be as the angels of heaven. Now, as you've seen here, it is possible to change something, to pervert something, to metamorphosize, or at least they can anyway, with the power they had. But it was not necessary because they didn't die. So we're going to be like that. So there aren't going to be marriages in heaven. That's what he's saying, very, very simply. And so he realized that the Pharisees, or the Sadducees rather, were trying to make up something to kind of trap him, but it didn't work. But this is the same thing here. So, and that scripture often is brought up, well, like, if this is all true and Genesis 6 is angels and women, how does that work? Because they can't do that. It doesn't say they can't. They're not designed for it. They're not made for it. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't, if they wanted to, find a way to pervert something. And again, that's where I've talked about, we've looked at this whole concept of genetic tampering, and it may be that simple, that maybe they didn't actually have sex and reproduce the way we do. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Seems like they did. But the whole concept is, however it was done, and it wasn't supposed to be done. And that's what Jesus meant. So we're going to be immortal, basically, is all that means. So he goes on, and here's the judgment. And he's already given the judgment that they have to watch the Nephilim civil war destroy themselves, and then they are chained up in Tartarus until one of the judgments. So the question then arises, what happens to the giants, the Nephilim? Obviously, their bodies are destroyed. And of course, there's other questions come up, like, was there a second incursion after the flood? Did some of them escape through the flood? We're going to see what the manuscripts talk about that. But the first question is, if at least 90% of them, if not all of them, died, then the flesh is gone. So there's no monsters hiding out in the tree that's going to eat you or anything. All gone. But if they're like angels and they're like humans, there is a spirit. So what happens to the spirit? Does it go to heaven? Does it disintegrate? What's the rest of the story? And so here's what he says. Verse 8 of chapter 15. My judgment for the giants is that they were born from flesh, and they will be called evil spirits and remain on earth. Now understand, this is a kind of a weird situation. You and I are human. We're born with a sin nature. So no matter how good we want to try to be, there's still that sin nature that can't be completely overcome, which is why we all need a savior. So when you say, in a sense, it's not my fault, it's Adam and Eve's fault or Satan's fault or whatever, but in either case, I inherited this before I could say yes or no. So we kind of deserve a chance at salvation. And you might say the same thing with the Nephilim. They were born that way. So, what's the judgment? So the angels understood everything. They were mature and they still did what they did. So they get judged. The children, slightly different story. But he goes on and says, the giants, since they were born, are from flesh, and they will be called evil spirits and will remain on the earth. So when the Bible talks about, or any other text talks about an evil spirit, it's an ungodly spirit, because they were all seem to be ungodly. That's the spirit of a Nephilim, or one of the sons of this group. So angels have a type of body, however that works. I don't know. I've never seen one. We have one of flesh, and I know what flesh is. They have a different kind. Jesus, when he resurrected, has yet again a different kind. And Paul says in the resurrection, we don't know what we will be like, but we know we'll be like him. He says, because they were created from above, from the holy watchers, at death, their spirits will come forth from their bodies and dwell on earth. So bodies gone into the dust, spirits dwelling on earth. They will be called evil spirits. The heavenly spirits will dwell in heaven. The terrestrial spirits who were born on earth will dwell on earth. So they're called terrestrial spirits, and they're also called evil spirits. And that makes you think that maybe some of them are evil, and others are not. So I don't know, but either way, it comes from the same group. The evil spirits of the giants will be like clouds. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but he comes on and says they will afflict, corrupt, tempt, battle, work destruction on the earth, and do evil. They will not eat nor drink, but be invisible. Obviously, spirits are. They will rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. So in other words, it's like you can't eat anymore. You can't have any pleasure. You're trapped in this dimension, and it's all because of them. So the normal ungodly attitude is going to be, I'd like to seek vengeance on them. There's not much you can do, but there's a few little things you can do, and you get really good at causing problems like that. So that's the situation that's going on. So when someone talks about, there was like in the New Testament, in the Gospels, Jesus goes somewhere, goes into one of the synagogues, and there was a man possessed of an unclean spirit, or an evil spirit, or sometimes it'll say a devil or a demon or whatever. It's the King James words. It is a Nephilim spirit. And that's what demons are, according to these manuscripts. So if we go on to chapter 16, this is small, so we'll get done with this. Chapter 16 says, when the giants die, their spirits leave their bodies, their flesh will decay without judgment. There's no reason to judge something that just goes into the dust, okay? In this way, the race will cease to exist until the great judgment, that would be the great white throne judgment that mentioned before in the previous chapters, in which the age will be wholly consummated over the watchers and the godless. So there's going to be a judgment seat of Christ at the rapture, and we're going to be judged according to our works and given rewards according to those judgments. Salvation is not by works, it's by faith in Christ. That's why we're all there to begin with. But at that judgment seat, depending on what we've done for the Lord, there are rewards. So that's a totally separate thing. That's his kids that are saved, and he's given rewards to them for what they did. The other people that aren't in the rapture, resurrection, judgment seat of Christ await the great white throne judgment, the one at the very end. Okay, so it says, now tell the fallen watchers who have sent you to intercede for them, you were in heaven, but did not learn all of the mysteries, just the worthless ones. And these, in your hard-heartedness, you have taught to the women, though these mysteries, and through these mysteries, the women and men have produced much evil on the earth. Therefore tell them, you will not obtain peace. So apparently, when you're reading this, it looks like they're saying that they really thought they had all the secrets of the universe and could take over. And in reality, there's even the angels back then at creation that's seen everything. They know nothing compared to what God can do. So it's that kind of a thing. And that's what he's saying here. It's like us, I don't have a bow and arrow anymore, but I have an automatic weapon. So I'm going to go take care of God. Really? Seriously. Bow and arrow, gun, tank, missile, nuclear missile. It's not going to do any good. So, but these guys somehow think, oh no, I can make it work. So again, it kind of seems like they were going to do their own thing, and they actually thought they could somehow manipulate something and get away with it. So that's the end of that one. So we will see later on there are other prophecies that come out. So in the series so far, we've seen the prophecy of the 70 generations, which is from Enoch to Jesus. We looked it up in Luke and saw that it was accurate. We've seen the prophecies from multiple places about the destruction of the earth through water, which we know about as Noah's flood, and then the destruction of fire coming. And in these texts, since they're so old, they don't know a whole lot more than that. But there are a few interesting little clues in there. So, okay, so we'll finish that. And let me at this point go back to the chat room, and we'll see if there's any questions over anything from today or from the fallen angel history section. So we've done 3 of these. And so next time would be Enoch's calendar. We're going to look at that. And then these dreams, the first and the second, number 5 and 6, are dreams that are partially back then, and they go all the way to our time period. So the ending parts of those dreams are prophetic for our time period. So it'll be interesting. Okay, looks like there's a few questions. First question is, have you ever heard of the Archko Volume, and is it genuine? Yes, yes, I've heard of it. The Archko Volume is supposed to be records from the church at Constantinople. If anybody would have had records, it's kind of like the Vatican archive. The Vatican archive is supposed to have miles and miles of ancient documents that are hundreds and sometimes thousands of years old, supposedly. And nobody knows what all is in there. Well, Constantinople would have been the same. They would have had a vast library like that. and supposedly it was destroyed, moved to the Vatican, whatever happened to it. Just like there was a big library in Alexandria, Egypt, which would have had records of a lot of things, probably including Essene documents, which would be these. So yes, it's that it could have happened, but there's no. The guy that wrote the Archko Volume wrote something, and he got something from it. I'm not saying that he's making anything up. You can tell by the writing he got something from somewhere, but there's no way to tell for sure that it's really records from Constantinople. And when you look at it, it's got some really interesting stories to it, which could very easily be true. There's a couple things in there that seem strange, but again, that could be from the translation also. There's some things in Enoch that I think are strange, and I think it might be the translation rather than someone inserting something. So it goes on and says, supposedly it has reports by Caiaphas on the crucifixion and resurrection, interviews with Mary and Joseph, and documents of the Sanhedrin. Yeah, it was originally made, I think, back in I want to say the first part of the century. So we will, when I get done with the scrolls, that's one of our projects is to look at the Archko Volume and other things like that. If they seem legitimate, and if they're older than 1923, I think is the cutoff date, we can reproduce them. So then we'll have a nice, easy to read print of those things. But yeah, it's got some interesting things. Interviews with Mary and Joseph. There's an interview with the rabbi that was the rabbi in Bethlehem that witnessed the light. You know, when Jesus was born, he describes the light that shone down. And there's these stories with Annas and Caiaphas about how Jesus appeared to them afterwards and basically said, "You were used to, to do this. Now you can repent." And so really interesting stuff in there. Again, some of it may be, and just because, even if it was legitimate completely, just because this guy really got real records from Constantinople doesn't mean all the records in Constantinople are correct. Much like if you got access to the Vatican, I mean, if I could, I'd be saying, bye-bye, guys, I'll see you in 50 years or whatever. And I'd be running over to the Vatican to dig through stuff. But I would fully expect some of it to be fake, some of it to be, irrelevant, some of it to be maybe good, but I might translate it wrong. Who knows? So there's always that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a really interesting volume. I have a copy of it. So, all right, next question. $20 super sticker. Okay. Thank you very much. Again, I appreciate all you guys that give gifts here, support us through Give, Send, Go and PayPal, and buy the books and things like that, and are part of our network and are here on YouTube and on all those things. So I really appreciate it. It helps us go forward so that we have the funds to hire people and to go forward to obtain these manuscripts and reproduce them. So thank you very, very much. Super chat, $5. Thank you. Again, a question. 11Q Melchizedek scroll is critical in arguing the providence of Jesus. How can I prove it came before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70? Well, number one, it was before the fall of Jerusalem that everything was destroyed and wiped out. So the Essenes would have hidden everything they didn't take with them that are hidden in the scrolls were before 70 AD. And so, but you can look at the questions and the dates, or not the questions, but you can look at the writing style and the parchment and things like that and get an approximate date. And you can look that up online. And I don't have anything to do with radiocarbon dating or anything like that, or analysis of the language. There's people a lot better for that. But it's supposed to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 BC. That doesn't mean it was originally written then, but it could have been written before. There was some people that were questioning it and saying it might have been written closer to 400 BC. That's the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So that would be really interesting if that's true. But yeah, in either case, it's pretty interesting. But let's assume that it was written at 70 AD or after Christians got there. That means the entire order believed Christianity is the fulfillment of that religion. When you read all the scrolls together, they all kind of corroborate that. So it's still really interesting. And 11Q Melchizedek, for those of you that don't know, it's 11Q13. It's the 13th scroll count found in Cave 11 of Qumran. And it literally says that this Melchizedekian priest is God incarnate, and that he comes to pay penalty for our iniquity, our sin nature. And that event happens one Shemitah after the end of the 9th Jubilee of their Ona, the 8th Ona. And again, we haven't looked at the calendar yet, but if you look at the calendar and you throw that over on the Gregorian calendar, it comes out to be 32 AD. You know, and I don't want to argue 31, 32, 33, give or take a year, whatever. But the fact that they would say around 30 to 32 AD is when the event takes place. And that not only reconciles us to God, pays the penalty for our iniquity, our sin nature, but it also begins the age of grace. And there's an overlap there. The age of grace proper didn't start until 75, but after 32, that's in that Jubilee time period. That's where the age of grace begins. So it's really interesting to see that. And it's got a lot more information in it too. And that's just one of those Dead Sea Scrolls. Is this judgment the same as last week's session where they could not lift their eyes in heaven to speak to the Lord? It might be. We'd have to go back and look at it and see. It's the judgment on the Nephilim. So yes, that's the judgment that's happening there. So that would be the same judgment, yeah. As far as when it's happening, I'm thinking it's going to be Great White Throne Judgment. Question, what is your favorite hymn? Ooh, I like a lot of them. Let me think. One of my favorites, hymns rather, older music things, is Rock of Ages. So that's probably at least one of my favorites. Genesis seems to make it very clear that the flood came due to the wickedness of man, but Enoch seems to point the finger at the genetic meddlings of the fallen angels. Why the discrepancy? I don't think it's a discrepancy. I think that man would have gotten corrupted while we have a sin nature, so we have that corruption. But when you have someone move into town that says, I'll give all the poor people money as long as they do this evil stuff for me, I mean, the society changes very, very quickly. And ultimately, it is our decision. I mean, if I lived here and gangs started moving in and it got really corrupted and it got really weird, I saw it going that direction, then I should pick up and move or fight or, do something, vote, change it back, whatever, but not just set. And a lot of times they would just set or go along with the flow. If wives were given because men were mortal, then why was Eve, Adam's mate before the fall? Did I miss something? That's a good question. I think Eve was, number one, God knew where we were going with this, and he knew about the fall. So there's that as far as like the predestination based by foreknowledge concepts that are given. But yeah, to create the human race is the main reason. Maybe in the original plan, we don't know, but maybe in the original plan, it was for Adam and Eve to have a handful of children and then it to stop. So we don't know for sure. If they would have all lived, it would be the same. They're good questions. One of the things that's interesting to me is the more we learn, the more questions like that come up. Well, if that's true, what about this? And if that was answered, it would get at least two more questions. Where did Adam and Eve were Adam and Eve originally intended to be immortal, or was their lifespan on earth always going to be around 1,000 years? I believe they were originally intended to be immortal. And then the curse is that they would die before they're 1,000 years old, before the end of one prophetic day, the 1,000 years. And that was true. He died at the age of 930 according to Scripture. Could Enoch's description of the streams of fire coming from the throne in the same place as the hoarfrost be a description of God's throne in Eden on the volcanic and ice-capped mountain of the Lord? Ooh, that's a good point. That would be a perfect, now this is a vision trying to show prophecy, but still the vision would be accurate. So that is a really good place to have it, high up on a mountain where there'd be frost, ice, snow, and fire, lava, if it's a volcano. So yeah, that'd be the perfect description. So if this is not just a dream of a mountain-like place where there's a kind of a throne just for the vision, if in his mind it was based on a certain place, that would be really interesting to look at. Like maybe if Mount Sinai or someplace was high up enough to have frost and snow. There are some old legends of the altar of Noah and other things like that. So again, those are so old that I don't know that there's any records for sure, but it's an interesting idea. At the very least, we get the idea of the prophecy from it. Super chat too. Thank you very much. Again, we appreciate all the donations. 4Q instruction part 1 says, "Be humble. Do not say that I'm poor and will not seek out knowledge." What does it mean to be poor in this context? I think, and I could be wrong, but you're supposed to be humble and realize God's given you talents and God will give you the ability to fulfill what he's actually designed for you to do. But some people will say, I'm poor and I can't afford to seek out knowledge. You know, like for instance, if you felt God's calling to be in ministry, you might say, but there's no way I could afford to go to Harvard or go to this or that seminary or whatever. If you're serious, God will make a way. And here in the Calvary Chapel areas, a lot of our pastors simply don't go to the actual seminary, but have access to all the curriculum. So the way Calvaries are, it's like everybody needs to know this. And if you're interested, you could be pastor level by simply just knowing all the scriptures. You don't have to necessarily teach it, but if you did, you would know what you're doing. And so you can get all that stuff. It's probably online now, but it used to be that you get it for a donation, or maybe churches would buy it because they would be very, very cheap. You study at home, that kind of stuff. But I think this is an excuse. Someone who's humble will try to be godly and try to figure things out. In this case, to say, oh, well, I'm too poor for that, you know, or that kind of thing. Or another excuse might say, well, I have a wife and kids to feed, and I've got bills to pay, and I just bought a new house and a really big mortgage. So I really can't afford to just like stop and go over and study. And well, make a way. Maybe you can't afford to stop and go over there, but make a way. Be humble. That's a kind of inhumility if you think about it. I can't do this because I'm doing something else. It's that kind of a thing. Now, if the Lord doesn't want you to, he may not make a way for it. So that's a possibility. But that attitude, I think, is what we're talking about. I'm poor, therefore I won't seek knowledge. And sometimes we have people, and this is a really bad thing too. Some people will say, I'm such a sinner, I can't be saved. I won't even mess with it. Well, if you would mess with it, you would begin to see that there are people far worse than you and much better than you, but they all can be saved. And so that means you can too. And so don't use that to say, oh, well, I've just done so much. No, you wanted to do that and you want to use that as an excuse to not study and go to church. And if that's what you're doing, that's what you're doing. But at least be humble, be honest about it, I think is what this is saying. 4Q instruction is really interesting. So we put 4Q instruction, the Damascus covenant, and all the related material that's the same kind of stuff together in our Damascus covenant book. Really interesting. Defines a lot of terms used in the New Testament that we didn't really know the full ramifications of. So if spirits are invisible, are UFO sightings, which are demonic, using avatars like suits to allow them to be seen. Well, spirits can appear at certain times, and I'm not sure again how to do that. I'd probably figure it out if I was a spirit, how to do something. Um, but yeah, I believe some of the UFOs are probably test things from our government. But yeah, a lot of the really weird UFOs that kind of just come and vanish out of nowhere, that would be demonic or spirits or something. Just like if you were talking to a person and they just vanished in thin air right in front of you, that's not normal. So if that happened, it was a ghost, it was an angel, it was something. So same kind of stuff. Um, if there is an actual crashed UFO that is made out of metal, material or something like that, then I would say, yeah, that's probably it. So if you think about this, what could be going on, I don't know that it is, but it's possible. If we have demons that are, you know, new off the bat about making metal out of the earth and making things, it's not hard, for instance, to make a helicopter. Just get a blade and a thing and off you go. So, however, anti-gravity might work, there might be some real simple way of doing it that we don't know, but that stuff might be known. On the other hand, or going along with it, it's also been another 4,000 years. So if you take where we are now with technology, and then say if nothing happened and we were able to just keep experimenting, 4,000 years goes by, where would we be? So it's that kind of a thing. So it's very possible that the abductions, UFOs, things like that are demonic experiments trying to get fleshly bodies again, things like that, which it's very hard to do apparently, but that could be something. We'll see later in time. It hints at it in Enoch, but in Jubilees it actually says that we learned about the angel, the demons rather, are just the disembodied spirits of Nephilim. But there were so many of them, it caused the human race to almost corrupt and implode again very quickly after the flood. And in the book of Jubilees, it says that Noah prayed that he would ban all these, just take them somewhere. And God decided to chain up 9/10 of them. At this point, what we just read is that the judgment is passed and they're just going to roam the earth. Well, 9/10 of them later get chained up in Tartarus. And when we see in the book of Revelation that the pit is opened and the demon locusts come out, that's the other 9/10. So if you think about it, we will have 10 times the demonic activity then than we do now. So you definitely don't want to be here during the tribulation period. But yeah, I think that's a very, very good possibility. There's a lot of speculation, and I want to kind of stay away from the speculation, or at least say this is a possibility, and I have no records or anything. What I want to do is show you the records. The records may or may not be correct, and even if they're correct, they may not be translated quite right. So all of that's a possibility, but at least there's something written. See, when we look at UFOs and all this other stuff, if there's nothing written per se, then it's just wild speculation. Even if I'm correct, I'm still just speculating. And I'm trying to stick mainly to what the manuscripts say. There are lots of records of UFOs actually going back to the earliest one that I remember was the memoirs of Christopher Columbus when he was coming over there. There were UFOs spotted in a certain place, and they all made interesting marks about them. Learned that in seminary. I had a good seminary, I think. Next question from a brother named Kenneth Johnson. I like that. Good name. What do you think the when knowledge shall increase in Matthew 24 pertains more to DSS than other extra biblical than the knowledge of the world? Or do you think that? Yeah, I think so. And it could be both. But Church Father Irenaeus made, and again, this is just his opinion, it's not scripture, so it doesn't really count. But Church Father Irenaeus said that, quoted that verse in Daniel about knowledge shall increase, and many will run to and fro to make the knowledge increase. And he says that whatever that is, occurs when Israel comes back as a nation, because then the prophecies will begin to be fulfilled. And the idea is, if you can see another half of the prophecies fulfilled, you probably would know exactly what the symbols mean and be able to know exactly what the other half of the prophecies are. So that kind of a thing. And he said that, and I've always went with that. But then there is a place, I think we talked about it in this series, but in Isaiah 29, it talks about a time when Israel comes back the second time. It's very obviously 1948. The old ones begin to speak out of the dust of the earth. And so that's really important for us to pay attention to. So when Israel came back in 48, as far as old manuscripts or the old ones, the dead people speaking like ghosts, up out of the dirt or out of the graves, that kind of thing. The big thing that would be connected with anything like that would be discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These people have been dead 2,000 years, but their words come up out of the dirt, just like a ghost or a dead person. You're talking to the old ones. So putting those two together, I'm thinking it's extremely important for us to study the scrolls. If Isaiah 29 is really referring to that, I think it's interesting that Isaiah was the first scroll that was bought by the Israelis when this whole thing started. So that prophecy was in there. But it could also very well be technology in general, because I don't think we'd have the scrolls without this technology we've had. So right now there are certain things like the plaster from Joshua's altar. There's no known way of scanning it to see what's written on it without breaking it up and destroying it. And eventually we'll figure something out to be able to do that. So it'll be interesting to see how all these other things work. Is the plant of righteousness and truth in the book of Enoch a real plant, or is it a symbolism? It's a symbolism of the nation of Israel and then the Messiah. So way back when, it's the lineage from Adam to Noah, and Noah through Shem down to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Jacob becomes Israel and starts the nation of Israel. Then it's the nation of Israel. If it apostatizes, we're talking about, the prophets and stuff. But then eventually the Messiah comes. The Messiah actually is the righteous plant. So in these texts, and that could be either or, but when you read enough of them, you're going to see, like in this vision, there was a tree. Okay, well, trees always mean the same thing. And then there was a rock. Okay, rocks always, and so you begin to see the symbolism. But the righteous plant that's mentioned in many, many manuscripts would be Israel, or specifically the Messiah and those that follow Messiah. What's fascinating is in Daniel 2, you've got the metal pieces of the image that represent the different empires. In Noah's Testament, in the book of Enoch, and then in the Ezra Apocalypse, it mentions those same metals in the proper order, calling them empires. In Noah's Testament, out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, he makes them mountains of metal. So it's fascinating to see the same thing in the same way, describing it differently, so you get to know the prophecies better. If the Nephilim cease to exist, why do some believe there are Nephilim now being created? L.A. Marzulli believes that they are creating new ones. Well, the prophecy is that those specific ones created by the angels pre-flood went to a civil war. They were all slaughtered, or at least the races were slaughtered. Now, there's something that happens post-flood that brings some of them back. Most of those were slaughtered, but some were not. And even if all of them in both camps were destroyed, the technology for creating them comes back. And that's part of another prophecy. In this series, 2 or 3 times back, we kind of went out of Enoch for just 2 times to look at a Dead Sea Scroll called the Book of Giants. And one part of that talks about how they did the genetic tampering. And so if this is real, if you were like a genetic scientist or whatever, you could look at that and say, I get it. So, and then you could start creating things. Might take you a while. Now, the angels would have been able to instantly see a lot of things that we can't. At least apparently. So yeah, so they're, And we can see that as far as the term Nephilim meaning a non-stable life form, not just a giant, but we have pigs that have human hearts and human or more human and more, hearts and lungs, supposedly for transplants. And then there's all the other stuff. You can look up online when they finally were able to put a gene of a jellyfish in mice and cats and finally a given monkey to make them glow in the dark like a jellyfish. So just mix and matching the genes. Most of the time it doesn't do anything, but sometimes they're successful. So with all that stuff, and of course, a lot of us are real skeptical of genetically modified food because our bodies are not adapting to it very well and it's causing problems. And so that's one of the warnings in the scrolls from the Hagi, the herbal medicine stuff, to tell us to be careful with that kind of stuff. Prophetically, it comes back, and apparently it already has, at least parts of it like that. Hopefully not all flesh will corrupt itself again. Oh, there we go. Have you ever heard of the Lesser Keys of Solomon? Yeah, that is a grimoire from the medieval times. In the medieval times, they took, and there's some real things to it as far as names of places and events and techniques and stuff from the occult world. But in the Middle Ages, they compiled a lot of that stuff and created what's called a grimoire. It's something that an occultist would do to control the dead or control demons or whatever. And there's a book called The Lesser Keys of Solomon and a Greater Key of Solomon, and a few others that they're interesting to read just to kind of see. And then there's angelic symbols, things like that. But I would think the majority of it is just stuff made up from the Middle Ages. Much like the Kabbalah, there's some of that kind of stuff in the Kabbalah. But I think the Kabbalah started either in the 10th century or 11th century. And again, a lot of fake works kind of combined and some information from ancient texts to make it look good anyway. So yeah, that's what that is. I would suggest staying away from it. What is your view of original sin? Are we born already guilty of sin or merely with a inclination to sin? What about infants who die? Thank you for your insights. I'm not sure exactly how far that goes in each side, but on a practical level, I believe that we definitely have the inclination to sin. And an infant can start sinning. I mean, how many times do you know, as an infant, you have to keep saying no, 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 and they keep trying things. It's part of a learning process, but it's also because of a sin nature that's there. So we start sinning before we even realize what we're doing. So we have a sin nature. There's sin that starts immediately. There's also a thing called that most of us believe, based on like Romans 2 and a few other passages, that there is a age of accountability. So since Christ died for all of us, if you die as an infant or you just cannot understand anything, you never become an adult in your mind because you're damaged or something at birth, those people can't be judged. And so the Lord takes care of those. So it's basically those who become an adult, who understand, who choose to walk away from things that can be in a serious problem. So most of us believe that infants will not, like if the rapture was to happen right now, probably most of the infants would go in the rapture, if not all of them. Is the book of Enoch 10:17 saying we will grow very old? No marriage in heaven, but is there marriage on earth during the millennial reign? Do we get our family back? Also, will we be in agriculture? Well, we will be immortal like the angels, so we won't have marriage, we won't reproduce, etc. But there are those people, a handful at least, that make it through the tribulation period and they repopulate the earth. So they are like us. They have a sin nature, they're in the flesh, just like we are now. They repopulate the earth. Satan's not around to tempt, but there's still some problems because we all have a sin nature. And yeah, it's saying that we all grow very old. It's much like Isaiah 60 and 61. It talks about in the kingdom, if somebody was to get to be 100 years old and then die, it's like they died in their infancy. Nobody dies less than 100. I mean, that's like a baby dying for some weird reason. So yeah, the entire thing, it goes like that. It doesn't, if you're talking about the passage, it's talking about the ability to beget 1,000 children. Doesn't mean they will per se, but they could because they lived that long. It's kind of an idiom. So I think if your family are saved, obviously you'll know them in the resurrection. The book of Enoch 10:22, is it suggesting that one of the purposes of the millennial reign is to cleanse the earth? Who does the cleansing? Us, Michael, God, or all three? Good question. I don't know. There is a cleansing that goes on. There's a complete new heavens and new earth at the end of the millennial reign. I always thought it was Jesus doing it directly, but it's hard to tell. But he will at least oversee it. Super chat, thank you, $10. Thank you very much again for the donation. What are the sasquatch and the thousands have seen? DNA includes unknown male, human female. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, it seems to be something out there. Don't know if that would be something that's a Nephilim type creation or something else. It sure seems like it would be something Nephilim. And I don't, again, I'm not an expert in DNA, so I don't know if that's true or not. I've heard the same things. If it really does always come back unknown male, like maybe there is or is not a human male as far as the genetic parts, but there's definitely human female, that would give you like Nephilim type ideas anyway. A lot of people think the Sasquatch type things are demonic. Could be Nephilim, could be something like that. Again, it's hard to tell. Whether you're in the forest with large bears or Sasquatches or whatever else might be out there, wild cats or whatever, still just be very careful being out in the wilderness. Question, what's the best way to support your work? Through which path do you get the most of a gift? That would probably be Give, Send, Go. They're a great company to work with. We started working with them when we were using PayPal, which is like the biggest one everybody uses. Oh yeah, and there's a link to support the work. Thank you. We were using PayPal, and then PayPal came out with a thing saying if you're going to use incorrect speech, that they might actually fine you $2,500. And I'm thinking, like, I don't know how you could do that, but that would be an interesting legal battle. But I mean, who wants the headache for it? And they came back out and said, oh, that was a mistake. That was just something we were thinking about. Well, if you're thinking about it, you're thinking the wrong way. So freedom of speech is the way it should be, not trying to get people killed or anything. But yeah, so we decided we wanted to look for something else. And a lot of other people did too. Give, Send, Go is a group of people. It's a Christian company for that kind of purpose. So Christians can support Christians, people in need, just different things like that. I was really surprised. I opened an account with them and got it set up. And then later that day, I went to Walmart and I was in Walmart shopping and I get a phone call from, I think, Philadelphia or wherever they're headquartered. And it was somebody from Give, Send, Go. They wanted to thank me for it, wanted to know if there's a certain need or a certain type of thing, and wanted to pray with me on the phone. And that just blew me away. It's like, oh, this is fantastic. These are brothers in Christ. So anyway, so they have the processing fee with the credit card, and then there's an option to give them 1%, which I think is a fantastic idea. So that gives me like 90 some percent, 97%. Through when you donate through YouTube or Google, they take 30%. So I get like, if you give $100, I'd get 70. If you give through Give, Send, Go, I give like probably $97, something like that. PayPal would be probably very similar to Give, Send, Go. But again, that's spooky being told that something like that's going to happen. So anyway, I would suggest that. And then if you're interested, buying the books through Amazon and giving them to your pastors and friends and stuff, that helps us a lot. We'd get about half the money from that, or not quite, but close to it. But then you get an actual book that you can do things with. So thank you for asking. Really appreciate that. In the book of Giants, demons fought 4 angels who destroyed with fire, naphtali, and brimstone. Could these 4 be the angels of Revelation under the Euphrates to destroy the 1/3 with fire? I'm not aware of that particular thing, but it very well could be. If there's, I don't know if that's the same book of Giants that I remember, but that would be interesting to look that up. I'll copy that and see what I can come to find out. But yeah, there's got to be 4 under the Euphrates that are different for some reason. And the Revelation says they're kept there for a certain time to come out and destroy a 1/3 part of mankind. So something interesting like that. It's a good question. I'm not sure. I'd like to know why the Antichrist and the false prophet go directly into the lake of fire and not go into the great white throne judgment like everyone else. That's a good question. I've wondered that too. There's got to be some specific reason for it, because it sure seems like it's actually saying they do that right then and there. So I don't know. That's a good question. Super chat, $10. Thank you for making the PDF of the Book of Enoch freely available. Oh, well, the Book of Enoch is already out there. So I did make the PDF of our translation of Gad public domain also, not my commentary, but just the translation. Because you can go out there and find Jasher, and you can find Enoch, Jubilees, and most of these other works. Gad was one that, as far as I know, had never been translated into English. I think we were the first ones to do that, actually. There's several Hebrew versions. There was a Dutch version and something else, I think. But anyway, so that's kind of important that we have that to study. So we released that to public domain. But thank you very much. Psalm 78:25 says that manna is angels' food. Is this a prophetic, poetic expression, or is that for real? I don't know for sure. If it's poetic, it would be like it's the softest, best for you. It seems to be really good for you if they can eat a little bit of it and like regenerate like crazy, heal like crazy. It would be really good. Angel, I don't know for sure. I don't know if angels actually eat, but it seems like that. My guess is that it's actually angels' food, but I don't know for sure. I'd really like to see some, because when you look at it in the Old Testament, they would eat it and then run for miles and those kind of things. And it seems like, might be other things combined with it, but it seems like eating manna, that manna, would like really heal you. Overlap of 50 years for the age of grace, hoping there's an overlap of 50 when it comes to the millennial reign begins. Is that a possibility? Yeah, a very real possibility. Not only from the scriptures that talk about those days will be shortened, but the whole fact that the ages end exactly when they end. So there's no question about it, 75 AD and 2075. So you would assume that the rapture, if the rapture happened right at the beginning of the tribulation was 7 years and ended at the second coming. If you assume 2075 is the second coming, you back up 7 years, and then you'd have a good outline of that kind of stuff. But looking at the first coming prophecies and the others, that might be the case, but not necessarily. It's a series of events that changes the ages over. And it usually starts 100 to 150 years before. and goes 50 to maybe even 100 years into that next age. So, and we've seen that Israel coming back is like a big piece of the beginning of that, which was in 1948. So that would be like 125 or so years before the end of the age. So we've had a whole lot of things happen in that time period. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, there's a definite possibility. One of my theories is that maybe the year 6000 is when the Lord actually dedicates the temple, the millennial temple. And if that's the case, if he doesn't just do this and make it happen, if we build it or help build it or whatever, it might take 10 or 20 or 30 years to build a magnificent temple like that. So, you back it up 10, 20, 30 years, there's a lot of other reasons why you can't really set a date, but we know the season and we know the Jubilee, or the last generation, is the last 50 years, starts in a year and a half. So we're right there. That doesn't mean the rapture can't happen tonight. It could happen tonight, whenever, but it's interesting to try to plug those in. But there are still several prophecies, several wars, and different things that happen before the second coming, or at least before the temple anyway. So, and those look like they're in process right now with the current wars that are going on. Super chat, $10. Thank you very much. Who compromises the armies of heaven in Revelation 19:4? I would think it would be angels. Don't know for sure, but I would think it would be angels. The stars falling from heaven, fallen angels, and UFO crashes, are they all the same thing? I don't know. I wouldn't. If something actually, if a UFO actually crashed, then it had to be something that is, solid material, which is still, I would say, is associated with them. But fallen angels, I don't think it would be directly connected. I think they'd be slightly different. But again, I really know nothing of UFOs. Is there anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls about the mark and the number 666 being the number of his name, or how it's calculated? Not in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There is a section in Irenaeus's book, Church Father, from about 170. He was writing his book on cults, and he ran across, according to what he was saying, there was a certain cult that said they were the 144,000. Sound familiar? No, it wasn't them. It was a different group back then. But he was trying to explain why they couldn't be, and that drifted into the 666, the number and stuff. And so he stopped and he wrote Polycarp just to make sure that he had it right, because it was some minor point in their theology. So he asked Polycarp, how did John ever explain how we calculate it and what it's supposed to be? Because I don't think it's what they say it is. Polycarp actually wrote him back, and he records this in the church work. And we have that in our End Times by the Church Fathers book, by the way. But anyway, he said, yes, actually, John said, first off, not to worry about it, because a lot of people will have a name that equals 666. So you want to wait until after you see the 10 nations form. So if we're still here, somebody will be. So if you're here and you see 10 nations form out of what used to be the Roman Empire, then look at all of the leaders of those things. Somebody from a country north of Israel, somebody, there's several other prophecies about the birth of the Antichrist. But out of the handful of people that would be there, one of them will have a name that equals 666 when spelled out in Greek. And that surprised me. I figured it'd be Hebrew, but it's Greek. According to what he said, if that's correct and it hasn't been, tampered with or whatever. The way it works is in English, we have letters for words and we have numbers for numbers. And they're two different character sets. A and the number 1 look totally different. In some languages, they look the same. So like the letter A, if it's used as a number, it would be 1, B would be 2, C would be 3, that kind of thing. Or if it's a word, it's just A, B, C. So it depends on how it's used. It's the same character set. So like, for instance, my name is Ken, Ken. That comes out to be 72. I'm very glad it's not 666, but I'm 72. So there would be a guy, and there's a handful of them. And in the text that Irenaeus was saying, he gave the example of, I think, Titan, Nero, and a few other names actually do equal 666. Obviously, Nero is not the guy. It might be a Nero, but it's hard to tell. But the name would end that. The thing that confuses me, though, is I can see a name like the name of a president of the United States or whatever is whatever it is in English. And when it's spelled in Greek or in Russian or something, sometimes the language changes the word. Like I know William in Spanish, if I'm correct, was Guillermo. That's totally different. I don't know how you get that kind of a, so it makes me wonder about that. That's probably going to be the most complicated thing to look for the Antichrist, but it's one of them that'll be obvious at that time. So yeah, Church Father Irenaeus had mentioned that, but there's nothing in the Dead Sea Scrolls about it. Is there anything in the scrolls or the scriptures that talks about the Holy Spirit empowering the believers in the last days to miracles? In the scriptures, there are Joel's prophecy about the sons and daughters prophesying. Now, Peter quoted that and said this was a fulfillment of Joel, and it was, but again, that was at the end of their age. And at the end of our age, a lot of those things repeat. And the actual prophecy in Joel says that that would happen, and then there would be blood, fire, and vapor of smoke before the terrible day of our Lord comes. And so it kind of connects them all together. So I believe it happened, as Peter said, back in that time. It's the end of their age, would also happen at the end of our age. Now, that being said, it seems like almost everybody that I know of that speaks in tongues or prophesies is making it up out of their own heart. But I believe that the gifts continue. The church fathers actually said the gifts would continue up to the second coming. All of the gifts, church gifts. I don't see very many people healed. I don't see very many prophecies, that kind of stuff, but I believe they exist. Or, well, people in church prophesying. This stuff I see, which is pretty interesting. Do you think it's possible that the dinosaurs were part of the DNA experiments that the fallen watchers did? Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. My wife thinks that too. She came up with a theory that maybe the herbivores were God's creation and the carnivores were Nephilim creations, which is kind of an interesting thought. My thought is, unless we've got it garbled, if you think about a T-Rex, biggest dinosaur, great teeth, and these itty-bitty arms that it can't really do anything with because it's just, so it's like if it really looked like that, if we didn't get the arms of one connected with the wrong dinosaur, that's just weird. Now, granted, it could grab a tree, but if it's eating animals, there's not too many animals in a tree. That'd be something like an herbivore would do. So yeah, there's definite things like that. There's a few, we'll get to them eventually, but there's some other Nephilim studies we've done. I think we've got one or two up on YouTube about like the Genesis 36 Nephilim stuff. So there's some very interesting things out there. How is it that the second group of angels rebelled and fell after the flood? When clearly some of the hybrid giants who survived by hiding in caverns, like Joshua, Og, okay, are seen later. Yeah, we're not told the exact story. Either somehow some of them escaped through the flood. The book of Enoch seems to indicate that didn't happen. They were all completely wiped out. But that could be wrong. This is the Ethiopic version, so I would, again, love to see the Aramaic copy that's floating around out there somewhere, or it's in private collection. But that's what's interesting. These things do exist. We just can't quite get our hands on them. When we do, and if we have the funds and everything at that time, man, we're really going to try to get that published. My guess is it's going to be really, really close to the one we have. But one of the things that's interesting with the calendar part for the longest time, nobody could figure out the leap year. And when we started looking at the Dead Sea Scroll version of Enoch 72 to 82, it's identical almost, but there was one phrase in there that helped us figure out how to do the leap year. It's just a couple of words different in the Ethiopic, but that was just a couple of words enough to really garble the text. So, yeah, some people don't think there was a second group of angels after the flood. I don't think that, but I mean, I could be wrong. But there are texts that talk about Cainan. Then you'll see this in Jubilees and a few other places, finding the records of the Watchers and then recreating the technology. Said if he could do that, and then eventually you got giants in the land of Canaan. If he can do that, we could definitely do that today. And that's where it's spooky going forward with this stuff. So there's definitely hybrids, giants back then, and apparently there are now still, either again or have always been, whatever, from the post-flood era. The technology is definitely the same because it's just genetic mixing. However you do that, it's the same thing. It's just genetics. How it happened or how many different ways it happened, we're not exactly sure. We have a few records of some of them, and we'll get to that. Yeah, Og is an interesting character. Question, did hybrids like mermaids or mermen survive the Great Flood? Oh, that's a good question because they would have been water creatures. I doubt they existed and did because of the way, again, the way the text in Enoch says, but again, it's Ethiopic. So when you just have, it's like Genesis 6, it says the sons of God, the daughters of man, and then it goes on. That could be anything. And then you get Enoch that says, well, here's basically the story, and here's a couple of chapters. Okay, now we know for sure the sons of God and the daughters of men. Not much more, but we know that for sure, genetic tampering and that stuff. So when it gets to like in Enoch, there's only one or two verses that say nothing escaped the great flood. Well, how does it mean that? If we had another text that gave a paragraph or two, everything was totally destroyed, no flesh survived, not one Nephilim or anything escaped the flood. I mean, a few sentences to make sure we know we're talking the right way. Because so many times when it's translated into one language, it says exactly the same thing, but in that language, it has a different meaning. And so when there's just like one word or one little phrase, it probably means what you think it does, but not necessarily. So I doubt it, but you never know. First off, if there were mermen, mermaids, and then did they survive, and have they survived since then? A friend of mine listens to someone who is convinced that the book of Enoch is from the intertestamental period. How would I answer this? It's obviously been retranslated, so in a sense it is. The first off, there's a Hebrew version. It gets translated into Ge'ez and then to Amharic and then into English. So basically the Hebrew to Ethiopian to English. In the process of doing that, one of the people asked a couple of weeks ago about what about Dan and what about other stuff? There are place names in the book of Enoch that shouldn't be there. Well, it's obviously a translation later, And like I said, if I was doing my own Bible translation, when I get to Daniel, I wouldn't say Persia and put and that kind of stuff. I'd say Libya and I would say Iran. And it's, and then you would look at the text and say, obviously that's printed sometime after 1939 when Persia changed its name to Iran. Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean the text itself didn't pre-exist. So yeah, there's evidence that it's intertestamental, but that doesn't really make any difference. It's a translation going back. But good question, and that would be a really good answer. So yes, they're correct in a sense. The question is there anything that's actually from the real book of Enoch further back? And like when we get to number 5 and 6, let me turn this off real quick. When we get to number 5 and 6 down here, these dreams, and you see that they actually fit what's going on now. There's no way these could accidentally fit now. It has to be a real prophecy. So this part, at least, has to be at least partially correct. Daniel 2:4-40, and it's okay in Revelation, say that the 10 kings will arise in the last days. Do you think this could be referring to the 10 remaining monarchs of Europe? Since January 15th, all have male heads. It's possible. The prophecy basically seems to indicate there are 10 kingdoms or countries, basically, that come out of a kingdom. So we had the Roman Empire. And right now, if you look at what used to be the Roman Empire in its height, and then include the Byzantine Empire too, and maybe even Ottoman, so there's a lot there. But like, for instance, Australia is not part of any of those. So Australia is not that. But it seems like out of that area, there will be 10 countries that are just countries. But then they come together and maybe they take over other countries or whatever, but they end up becoming a revived Roman Empire. That could easily be done in Europe, could be done in the Middle East, could be half and half, that kind of stuff. And so there's some very interesting studies to pull those together. To the complete picture, I think we will have when we look at a detailed study of Daniel with Revelation, with the Ezra Apocalypse, specifically the 2 or 3 prophecies toward the end, and then also Noah's Testament. And then there's some other things in there too to pull out. And then whatever the church fathers, to see how they interpreted the prophecies. I think you need to pull all of those together, and we could have not a very clear picture, but a clearer picture. And then as we're going into the 2020s and eventually 2030s, I think we'll be able to figure it out really easy. At least I hope so, anyway. What do you think about a pre-Adamic society? Do you think the Earth is young or old? I'm personally a young Earth creationist. That doesn't mean there couldn't have been something before, but basically Adam was 6,000 years ago, and I think Adam was a special creation and then went forward. There could have been a pre-Adamic society, but there's nothing that really pinpoints it. There are certain scriptures that make it look that way, at least in English. Hebrew, not so much, but you could build a case for it, but it's still a lot of guesswork. What I would like to see is like a Dead Sea Scroll or something somewhat authoritative to come along and say there was a group of people before Adam. They were called the whatever. They lived over here. This is what they looked like. This was their first president. Some sort of a little history thing. Again, with a couple of paragraphs, then you really know somebody believed in one, and maybe it actually happened. But the estimates, it's really, really hard to go on just a verse or two. But that you can't, and you can never prove a negative. So just because I say I can't disprove it, it probably did not happen. But if you can't disprove it, it could have happened. So it's one of those questionable things. I know Gary Stearman is an old Earth creationist, so I thought that was interesting. We've had some discussions on that. During the Millennium, will people like Enoch and Elijah and John train us how to live as immortals among mortals? I think so. It'll be interesting because we'll remember what it's like. But then again, I tend to forget what it was like when I was a teenager. So, we probably will need to be very careful governing that. I read the Dead Sea Scrolls calendar, tried to lay out a timeline for Passover week, but I'm a day off. I started with Passover on Tuesday, Nisan 14 in the morning pattern. I think we have a video of that up, and if it's not clear or we don't, I'll try to remake it. But basically, let me just show you here real quick. On our DSS calendar, we'll just pick like this year or whatever. Well, here's this year. So it'll be March 20th as New Year's. But the first is always on a Wednesday. So Passover, oh, let me just undo this here real quick. Oh, okay. Second part of that question is there something more such as a leap week that I'm not including? Yeah, there's a leap week, definitely. Okay, that's another question. So let me just come back to that. So anyway, the first is on a Wednesday. Passover is always on 14. So Jesus would have had the Passover Seder with his disciples on the 14th. The day always starts in the evening, so at nighttime. So we would have had it Tuesday night. He would have been taken and crucified Wednesday morning, laid in an airtight tomb before the high Sabbath, which is actually the 15th. So before sundown on Wednesday, he would have been put in an airtight tomb. Okay, so then the 3 days and 3 nights prophecy kick in. So you've got Wednesday night and Thursday, Thursday night and Friday, Friday night and Saturday. So that means he would resurrect sometime after sunset on Saturday night. Now the Bible says Sunday morning at dawn, first light, the women go down to anoint the body with the oil and stuff and find that the stone is already rolled away and his body's not there. And then they get upset because they think he's been moved. So this fits perfectly with the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. So again, Passover with his disciples Tuesday night, crucified on Wednesday, and then Wednesday night, Thursday, Thursday night, Friday, Friday night, Saturday, resurrected Saturday night, and they can't find him Sunday morning. So I think that's the proper way of looking at that. Hope that helps. So wouldn't that be the last trump of the 7 trumpets in Revelation when we're raptured? Oh, okay. The well, first off, the book of Revelation was written after Paul talked about the last trump. And so I don't think the last trump is referring to the book of Revelation. They may be referring to the same thing, but he would have had to have got his information from some other scroll. There is a text that talks about the festival of the last trump being Rosh Hashanah. The festival of the great trump is Yom Kippur. The festival of the first trump is Pentecost. So if he's using festival language and he says it'll happen at the last trump, then he's talking about some year on a Rosh Hashanah, the rapture will happen. So it could be that. It could be a lot of different things. But I don't think the rapture happens on the 7th trump, because I think that is either in the middle or toward the end of the tribulation period. And the scriptures and the early church fathers all seem to indicate a pre-trib rapture. Good question, though. $50, thank you very much. Again, thank you very much for all the donations. They really help. Could the Kandahar giant have been from the post-flood giants? Could they stay alive that long? Yeah, I don't know for sure. We have something in our, the geneticists seem to think that if you could live a perfect life and have all the immunities and and all that kind of stuff, that you could live to about 120. But they say there's something in the cells after so many generations, they kind of self-destruct. So no matter how well you are, no cancer, no whatever, there's no way you could live past 120. And that may be true now. We used to live, I mean, Abraham made it to 175. Nimrod was 215. The longest recorded person was Methuselah at 969, because that's pre-flood. Totally different planet, atmosphere, pressure and all that. So obviously there's something that affects the genetics that way. If we could figure out what that is, you could go backwards. Is it possible for a giant then to live, to be basically semi-immortal? In other words, you could kill it, but if something didn't kill it, chop its head off, for instance, it would live forever. So that's something I don't know for sure. It's a possibility. There's been a lot of speculation. It's definitely post-flood giant, in my opinion. Where it came from, and of course, yeah, that would make it close to 4,000 years old. Well, it may not be. It might be the son of, it might be a lineage. So in that case, it's been the lineage at least has been around 4,000 years. So it's hard to tell how long it would actually live. Good question, though. Those are things L.A. Marzulli might get into. I like the fact that he delves into the genetics. He'll get samples and have them tested. Knows a lot more of that kind of stuff than I do. I'm just the scroll guy. So he'll ask me questions on if there's a scroll that says a certain thing, and then he'll ask me, or I'll ask him stuff on the genetics and that kind of stuff. So it's really good to be able to talk to each other in our areas of expertise. Really helps out a lot. Have you heard of any scrolls or pieces of scrolls turning up in the parts found in Egypt? I don't know if there was any there or not. There have definitely been pieces of things that we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that have been in the Geniza in Egypt, down around Cairo. And there are several other archives like that. There's one in Russia, one in Spain, and there's a few other places that I know of. That's another one, but I don't know of anything there, although that would be a good place to look. It's either going to be just general secular stuff, Gnostic stuff, art real stuff, or a mixture of all the above. And in many times they're small scroll fragments and we're not sure what they are, but good question. If anybody has anything from there that's big enough to really look at, we'd like to look at them. So let's see, we need to hurry up here, but a couple more questions. I heard about a disturbing book that's 2,000 pages long called the Book of Angels. Is this a demonic writing? I have not heard of that. So I'll take a look at it. Yeah, I have 2,000 pages, huh? I'll skim through it. I won't read that. Disturbing. If it's disturbing, it probably is demonic, I would assume. There's a lot of new stuff coming out, though, that it's just basically fiction. So, and I don't mean just now coming out like in the couple months, but like in the past, 500 years or so, there's been a lot of really weird stuff come out. Is there anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls that refers to a flat earth? I don't believe in a flat earth. Don't believe in a flat earth. Okay, what do you say? No, there's nothing in there that really says anything about that at all. Other than like the book of Enoch here, it's going to say, use terms that flat earthers would use, like the sun rose in the east and set in the west. Well, it didn't really, because we're a globe and we go around the sun, But from the Earth's vantage, it looks like it rises in the east and sets in the west. So the language is how you would see it, whether you know about the rotation of the Earth or not. It's just what you would see out there and how to mark the calendar and things like that. So no, it doesn't say anything about it at all. I'm not a flat earther. I believe in a globe. But I don't think there's anything in there that we could really take one way or the other. But I am following the pattern. Evening and morning were the first day, not the morning and the evening. This is where I get confused. Would they crucify someone on Wednesday if it was a high Sabbath? Well, the high Sabbath would begin Wednesday night. So Wednesday is actually part of Tuesday. In other words, the Tuesday night Wednesday. So yes, they definitely would. And in the manuscript or in the scriptures, they hurried. Normally, they would break the legs, and that way you can't push yourself up. You'd suffocate, and then you'd be dead fairly quick. That was the normal pattern. And it said with him they didn't, because they were in a hurry or something like that. Anyway, they pierced the side. So I forget exactly all the details, but so yeah, it could definitely be that way. But they took him down because the high Sabbath was coming. They had to hurry up and take him down. So yeah, Wednesday morning with the high Sabbath starting Wednesday night. Why would God make anything look old? To trick us? It makes the Bible seem like fairy tales to unbelievers. Yeah, I'm not. You're probably talking about like in the Garden of Eden, Adam being created as a physical adult. Uh, that's one of the old arguments. It's like, would a tree in the Garden of Eden, if you cut it down, would it have the rings? Because it has rings every so often. And then there's all those questions like, did Adam have a belly button? Probably not. He wasn't born, but he might look. I mean, it's one of those things. I don't know. So all those things that kind of come up. So I don't think God is trying to trick us in any way, shape, or form. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight, and we will pick up on this, probably go into the calendar next week, because I think we're done with the fallen angel history. We understand how everything happened up to the flood. We'll finish out the book of Enoch, and then later on we will at least do some things from Jubilees and the others. Maybe have a playlist of continued Nephilim studies, because of that. This is the stuff that's okay. I understand that. That's where demons come from, where Nephilim come from. What about in our time period? It's a little different, and so there are some manuscripts and different things that tell us how some of that stuff. So we will get into that. So I will go ahead and say good night, and we will talk to you next week. God bless.